Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Zenitsu, and you're listening to the Digi Talks podcast, the show that covers various topics from news to meta developments and everything in between for the fine folks who love the Digimon trading card game. Just as a quick reminder, I do stream this live over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, usually on Tuesday or Wednesday nights, and then it's uploaded as a YouTube video and a podcast on the YouTube channel of Zenitsu, while being on various podcasting platforms like Spotify for your viewing and listening pleasure, usually uploaded Thursday mornings. So feel free to leave a rating, like, follow, subscribe, or review, depending on the platform that you're listening on, if you feel like you want to follow the podcast and help support it. So today we don't really have a whole lot of meta developments because, well, there is none. We have no more events to cover when it comes to EX, or not EX7. We're about to hit EX7. But as far as BT 17.5, which is the fixed iteration of BT 17, there's just nothing. So today I am back with my design buddy Mark, and we're going to be talking about game pacing, because I've been sitting here and stooping on what my feelings are with the game and where some of the issues are, and trying to vocalize it the best that I can in terms of a script. So I think that game pacing definitely is a topic that people probably just aren't really talking about or acknowledging. I think where the game currently is, and this isn't just specifically a Digimon thing, but a whole TCG thing in terms of how it's developed and what the designers look to when it comes to defining good game pacing versus bad game pacing, and what kind of shapes how the game plays in terms of tournament structure and some other various factors that went into the game's overall creation and continuation. So this brings us to the question of the week, which will bleed into the main topic on what do you define as good TCG game pacing? So anyone in the chat or any listener or watcher, feel free to tell me your answer to this question down in the comments below. But Mark, what do you actually define as good TCG pacing? Or just pacing in general?
Oh, well, I guess in my mind, good game pacing is a little dependent on the game, and some games it can depend on what turn of the game you're on. But generally, a good game pacing is you have a variety of actions that you can take on your turn that will allow you to push your board state to a higher level to contest against your opponents, or to reduce your opponent's board state back down, so either you have the advantage or you've gotten yourself equal 1-to-1 with your opponent. You want to have enough actions to, kind of even the playing field or get ahead, and kind of that back and forth is what, I would look for in a game to have good pacing.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people, on a general basis, just kind of define pacing as turn count, and that's part of it, but it's on what specific turn is the game in a state to be doing more and more actions. So it's just usually turn 1 is going to be the most simplistic turn in the entire game, because that's usually where you're going to be starting to set up. Some games just go absolutely ape wall on their turn 1, and that could define the entire rest of the game. And I think those games clearly have pacing issues because the game is so turn 1 dependent. And I don't necessarily think it should be that way. Some people like the explosive nature, but generally you want a good gradual build-up to a satisfying climactic finish. And
what good pacing would be also depends on the type of deck that you're playing. What an aggro player would consider good deck pacing, a control player would probably consider garbage.
that is true. And then we also have to factor in some of the systems and mechanics from each of the different games on, because it varies game to game on what is good pacing. Because if you're playing something like Magic the Gathering, where you're just drawing 4 lands in a row, you're not drawing actual usable cards. Sure, your mana base is expanding and then you're able to get more options when you draw those cards, but the fact that you're now falling behind in terms of developing a board state is what's making you fall behind creating a non-game, and that's also inversely true if you don't see your resource to be able to continue going.
Well, 100%. And I think that's something you run into with any resource game. Pokemon is another good example of a resource game, but Pokemon has an absolute metric ton of resource searching, or you have the option to put it in your deck, whether you put it in there or not. But there's so many cards that just say, "Hey, go search for a basic energy," or "Hey, go search for any energy." And there's so many cards like, going back to classic Pokemon on everybody, good old Professor Oak, where you just ditch your hand, draw 7 new cards, and you could play as many Oaks as you wanted. You could almost deck yourself out on turn 1 if you really wanted to.
I mean, I think there is a max of like 4 you could run, but you generally wouldn't want to do that. But the fact that they do give you the options to hand fix in alternative ways to try to reduce the amount of non games is the important part on why those cards are so necessary, because of how the initial design of the game and the game flow generally goes. And this is where I think like a lot of TCGs kind of want to race to try to be as quick as possible, and like that's more of a player thing rather than a TCG thing, because if you look at a lot of like the basic rules of TCGs, like the game isn't supposed to be generally moving as fast as it does based on the rules as written. It's individual cards and concepts that the designers expanded upon to accelerate game states. And I feel like too much acceleration is very much an issue. Magic learned this, just again as another example, really quickly with the Power 9, because you had artifacts that basically acted as lands that costed nothing. So that just accelerated the game state too quickly, because now you had lands and those to like do stuff you generally weren't supposed to on the early stages of the game, thus defining where the game state is actually going to go. And the same thing is kind of true with Yu-Gi-Oh, where it's just like there's so many special summons and extra summons and all that stuff that the game is basically devolved into like this combo game where you just combo off on your first turn, and then you ask the opponent, break this or you lose. And if they break it, then usually they win. So it's just like, oh, cool. I either break this and lose, or break this and win, or don't break it and lose. And that's all done literally on the first turn with how much like combo play and searching is in Yu-Gi-Oh! And I would think that's pretty poor pacing, because the more actions you generally are allowed to take, the more complicated the turns get and the longer they last. And like this is where pacing is just such a broad term, because we could be talking about turn pacing in terms of turn count, turn time pacing in terms of what is your reasonably expected amount of time you should be spending on a single turn, and like just there's so much that goes actually into pacing.
Well, absolutely. And like you said, the amount of actions you take in a turn increase the amount of time your turn takes, obviously, because it takes time to perform those actions. But also, you have to take into account that every action that you possibly can take in a turn, you will have to also account for the fact that you will probably need to take time to consider order that you take those actions in. As it's very possible that if you take one singular action out of order, or theoretically, if you decide like, hey, I should probably do this next before I do this, and I'll get the payoff from that, but you don't, then it's all of a sudden like, well, my combo just ended because I made a bad call. I know that was true way back when I was learning Magic. My friend who was teaching me got me into Legacy, and he was running a deck. Anybody who knows it probably is well aware of its infamous name, High Tide. And his first turn, pretty simple. Usually you play a land, plays an artifact, Sensei's Divining Top. Next turn, He uses top, plays another land. I mean, his first two turns are absolutely really quick. There's not much to him. But as soon as he hits that third turn, it's just like, okay, I'm going to spend the next like 10 to 20 minutes literally just doing math and doing combo and just trying to literally get to my win con. And that was like the whole turn three. And that's what he taught me. Like when, he was showing me how the deck worked, he's just like, this deck runs on a 3-turn counter of by turn three, you should be able to pop off and win. And as fast of a format as Legacy can be, like competitive Legacy, like 3 turns in some cases could be considered slow
Which
for
is
the kind of
crazy
a
to think
format.
about. Yeah, which is crazy to think about because when I was just experimenting with Master Duel, because free online client, it is its own special little format that some people kind of like, some people kind of hate, because it's a mix of like OCG and TCG. But regardless, when I started playing Yu-Gi-Oh on Master Duel for a hot minute, just to like see where the game currently is at. I was playing Salamangrates because that's the deck that I have physically, and I wanted to see what it can do. And I'm just like sitting here, and I'm like, what am I exactly doing? Like, because the cards all search for themselves, and basically like there's a particular turn order in which you have to play them. And so like when I looked up the combo, like just a general combo sheet, I think I printed off like 18 pages of different hand, like starting hands, and the combos that you're able to go into based on those starting hands. And as a player, like a new player, expected to basically memorize that on top of matchup knowledge, that's just that's too much to ask for. Like that's getting to where pacing can cause game complexity to go through the roof. Um, and that's just two examples from two of the bigger games that are currently on the TCG market. Pokemon has its own weirdness and goofiness to it as well, where it's just like, oh, you could have a non-game because they could have one starting Pokemon, no bench Pokemon, and if you're able to basically just cheese energy and attack them and knock that Pokemon out before they could respond because they're bricking on their hand, because that does happen in Pokemon quite often, then you could just win the game literally turn two out of nowhere. And like, was that really a fun experience at that point? Was that even a game at that point? And like each game kind of tries to have countermeasures to try to reduce the amount of non-games, which increases the the overall better pacing of how the game is supposed to flow.
Right, and there's some games that definitely try to design themselves around the concept of really limiting those non-games, because I know it's not 100% foolproof, but in my experience playing Weiss, there is very few situations where at the very start of the game you can have such a bad start that there's like no coming back from it. Now, granted, I have definitely seen it in tournament play. My opponent just bricks so hard they can't stop taking damage. They can't answer the board state. They literally just get behind and they stay behind. But I've certainly seen it the other way around where I can push my opponent really early in the game because he drew all of his climaxes, which he needs to cancel damage. But then by the time he gets to refresh, he has that slight advantage of being at the higher level, so he can control the board state much better. So the chances of me maintaining board state or winning against him is extremely low. So as long as he's able to somehow start to mitigate damage, he's now got the bonus of being able to maintain that board state, which helps keep it from being a non-game. But I mean, obviously, if he can't stop the damage, the board state's not going to do him any good. And I know Vanguard's kind of an interesting one in that sense because it kind of I'm not a big player in premium or V, but I know in those ones you don't have a ride line to be guaranteed to ride up all the way to your grade 3, and there's the mechanic of I think it's called G assist, where you got to ditch 2 cards just permanently from the game. You can reveal the top 7 and take one, so you're already behind. So I mean, I know it's possible to win from that state, but you're already behind. It's not going to be, it's not going to be an easy game. You're literally uphill climb the rest of the game at that point.
And like I think Vanguard is the epitome of like on base, Vanguard is designed around the idea on having a good pace gameplay where it's just like you'll start off on your main card as a grade 0. Your turn 1 you'll generally go to grade 1. Your turn 2 you'll go to grade 2, your turn 3 you'll go to grade 3, and then you'll basically each pass on one turn of each of their grade 3s being at max capacity, and then the game is kind of supposed to be over at that point. So like they worked their level up system into how the game's pacing is generally supposed to go. Obviously, again, there's always going to be exceptions based on the deck and the matchup and whatnot, but that's the idea on how, at least from a design standpoint, Vanguard tries to control their pacing is between what each player is supposed to do on each level and how much damage they're reasonably supposed to take on each level. And that's the point where they can kind of control and say, hey, maybe this grade 2 was just too powerful. It's just doing too much, therefore ending the game quicker. Let's do something to adjust. It's a little bit easier of a metric to look at. I don't know if they actually, ban or like do stuff based on that because I haven't played nearly enough Vanguard, let alone competitively. But that just seems to me like the idea on what they try to do to control pacing. A lot of, I'll call them Hearthstone-esque games because Hearthstone, you generate 1 mana a turn and then it accrues all the way up to a max of 10. You have a lot of games that are basically copying that same type of system because Magic's land-based system is absolutely garbage. But those incremental resource generating games kind of follow that same type of a trend where it's just like, okay, we know reasonably what each turn should generally look like in terms of not necessarily optimal gameplay, but like what type of a board state they're able to produce based off of how much resource they're given. One Piece does this really good with Dawn because you're always guaranteed 2 Dawn every single turn except for the first turn, and you can kind of gauge play based on Dawn count. It's just like, okay, this is their 9 Dawn turn. What are they reasonably going to be doing on that deck with 9 Dawn? So like it's almost like chessifying it in a way where it's like chess has the book of chess and they almost kind of have to create like in their heads the book of the game where on what turn what is the expected outcome. At least like I would think that games would want to try to do that because that's not necessarily the easiest thing to do, but once you have that type of an idea down, it would be way easier to balance and manage the game once you have that type of a playbook written out.
Well, I was going to say you mentioned chess, and that's literally the Yu-Gi-Oh deck that you mentioned. If you had to print off 18 pages on all the opening moves, you're literally playing chess at that point. You're not playing a TCG.
Well, I mean, when Yu-Gi-Oh's also heavily dominated by their first turn, like their first turn dictates if the game is over the following turn or not. Like that game has pacing issues to an extreme level, where it's like turns will take 20 plus minutes, comboing off, expecting to see like how to play around hand traps and all that other jazz, or if there is no hand traps, how crazy hard can you go? Like Yu-Gi-Oh is just an absolutely messed up game, and I was talking, like, not to try to get too sidetracked, I was talking to one of the owners of the LGS that I frequent, the new one that I'm frequenting, and he was just like, yeah, in, like, the US, Yu-Gi-Oh is losing to Lorcana. Like, Yu-Gi-Oh is actually exiting the Big Three territory, and that's crazy to think how bad Yu-Gi-Oh is to basically make their players just want to leave the game. And part of that is well, yes, a bad meta or a consecutive string of bad metas, but those bad metas are amplified by poor pacing issues because now games don't feel rewarding or satisfying.
Well, and I can't speak to all players, but in a lot of ways, I'm not a big fan of sitting there and waiting for my opponent to do a 15-minute turn, and then I have to, a lot of times you have to kind of follow along, see what they're doing, and then you have to analyze the board state at the very end of it. And if you have counters in your hand, you have to be paying really good attention and like, do I counter this or do I hold on? You have to know when to jump in, when not to jump in, and it's like, I guess for me, when my opponent's turn is taking that long, it's like, you know what? I really don't want to be paying attention to their turn. I don't. I'm not even sure if I really even want to be here for this. I mean, I get control decks. They got to think about stuff. They got to really plan. Like 4 turns into the future kind of thing, because that's the deck style. But at a certain point, you need to ask yourself, like, reasonably, how long should any player, no matter what deck they're trying to play, how long should they be spending on their turn? Because you don't want turns that are over in like 5 seconds all the time, because it's like, okay, well, that game's going way too fast. I mean, if you can play best 2 out of 3 in less than 5 minutes, like, well, maybe the game's a little too rushed. But you also don't want the inverse of, well, every player's turn is taking 5+ minutes. Like, is there a way that we can speed this up? Is this an expectation? Are we expecting the turns to take this long? Because, there's certain times that the pacing does slow down when they have to start, doing a lot of thinking on what their actions are going to be. But that should be an exception, not the norm.
And this is where I think like Digimon in particular is in such a interesting state because usually all the games that we kind of listed except for Yu-Gi-Oh are like resource-based games. And a lot of games favor resource-based systems for this reason because it's easier to be able to control and manipulate the pacing based on how cost efficient or effective the card is going to be and how they could utilize it. And because Digimon's on the memory system, it kind of throws pacing on its head a little bit because of just what you're able to do to manipulate the memory. And that's like both a good thing and a bad thing because you'll get these turns in Digimon where we'll just say security control because everyone hates that deck. They should, with good reason. Their turns are usually pretty quick because they're basically draw go until something comes out and then they just play a kill card and then they just say, all right, my turn's done. And then the inverse on the other side of that table, when you're sweating against security control, you're just trying to think how to, like, what outs would they have and how to play to those outs. And obviously, it's going to take way more thought processing power to be able to navigate around something like that. And they're like, that's why everyone kind of hates security control because it's forcing the other player to actually think even more critically on top of what their deck already was doing to be able to play around what that strategy is and what their expected outcome is going to be when it comes to what their turns are going to do. And this is why, like, I think security control is extremely unhealthy for Digimon, but this is kind of why I like clock decks in just any kind of TCG. Not necessarily auto win conditions, just clock decks. Decks that are designed around a particular card that forces games to be in a particular time frame. Right now, the biggest example of a clock deck that we have is 7 Great Demon Lords. It's like, okay, I reasonably should be able to kill you within, I'll just say, an arbitrary amount, 7 turns. We'll just say 1 turn for each Demon Lord going under the gate, and then a Gudamon pops out, and then pop goes the Weasel, you win the game. Or you should win the game. Royal Knights was the countdown deck before that, where reasonably you should be able to win the game in about like 7-ish turns in that instance as well. 7 of the 13 Royal Knights underneath Yggdrasil, play the Omnimon, out comes the Maul, swing for game. So like that's kind of where clock decks for Digimon are really important to act as like cornerstones to dictate the game's overall pacing. I don't know if any of
Right.
yeah, I don't know if any other decks exactly have good examples of clock decks. I mean, I guess Nami in One Piece kind of is, just because she's actively trying to draw, but she can only draw so much, so it kind of puts it on the clock. Can you think of any example for like clock decks?
Well, like I mentioned earlier in the segment, the high tide deck, it's not necessarily on a clock, but if if you are doing everything you're supposed to, I mean, even if you have what might be considered like a bad hand on turn 3, you should have the capacity and resources in order to pop off and win the game. Now, obviously, if you go on turn 3 and you come up short, for the most part, you just kind of die if you don't win. So it's just like, well, I'm going to pop off and I'm either going to win or I'm not. And I mean, my buddy, he was, he's very clear. He's just like, turn 3 you should be able to go. And I asked him, I was like, are there times you haven't gone on turn 3? He's like, a few, but it's very rare because, as he mentioned, in the legacy format at the time, with the much more competitive decks, 3 turns was considered kind of on the slower side. And I remember seeing, decks like Affinity Artifacts, and Affinity Artifacts could basically do the Yu-Gi-Oh thing where turn 1 I could literally build my setup, and then if you can't answer the setup turn 2, you're gonna die. And I mean, there was other decks that had the capacity to just win on turn 1. I mean, there's some funny cheese decks that, if they got what they needed to and could push it and not get answered or punished for doing what they did, they could go really fast as well. But in terms of a much more like, maybe not like hyper paced clock deck, I'm not really thinking of too awful many off the top of my head in most other games. I know this is a real stretch, but I recall way back in the day when Secret Paladin and Hearthstone was a thing, that kind of was a clock deck because usually once you hit that turn 6, God, if I could remember the name of the card, but you'd play that 6 drop and you just equip like every single secret into your hand to your paladin. It's just like, well, you basically have 2 turns to answer it, or you die.
Yeah, I think like Hunter Taker for Hearthstone example might have been a better clock deck because of just how fast that card and like that combination of cards just accelerated everything. Because like usually what defines a clock deck is a resource or something that's constantly being built up over the course of the game that just has a point where it just explodes. So it's just a big rolling buildup that leads to a general explosion. Yes, you could kind of say, but all decks do that. But like usually this is more telegraphed in a specific card or play style. Because technically, some people would say, going back to Digimon with Demon Lords, like Demon Lords is a control deck. Well, all clock decks control until they have that inevitable explosion. Because, they need to set themselves up first to let that explosion be as impactful. And how do you do that? You try to slow the opponent down in case they're trying to aggress too hard because their deck can functionally move faster. So, like, that's kind of where, like, clock decks usually set a good benchmark, and each game defines what a clock deck would be a little bit differently, but they all generally have that common trend of a singular card slash resource that's being pooled into or pooled or funneled into one thing to then lead to an inevitable like ending.
Well, I guess on that topic, on keeping with the trend of Hearthstone decks, then would you consider the original Grim Patron deck a clock deck then?
No, I would consider that more of a combo deck just because like the idea is you get the Grim Patron out and then he just spawns infinite tokens of himself and you just are going to be punching them in the face with the infinite amount of tokens that you're able to spawn. Um
Well, if I can interject there real quick, like a lot of times when you saw the Grim Patron deck, Grim Patron wasn't ever what was swinging to kill you. It was always Warsong Commander rushing Frothing Berserker, and then you just made Frothing Berserker an absolute menace that just, one shot killed your opponent.
Yeah, just because it's
This this
taking
is
advantage
this is
of the
pre
damage.
this is pre Warsong nerf before
Yeah,
they said
I would
no
say that's
no
more.
haste.
I still kind of say that's kind of a combo deck because like it's there's not really a clock there. Usually the clock is going to be set up really early and it's highly telegraphed, which is why I think like Hunter Taker is a better example because you play the Undertaker turn 1 and then it's growing in power every subsequent turn until it's just so big that you just functionally can't stop it.
Okay, so the concept of the clock deck would be much more in line with Hunter Taker, where the clock more or less is Undertaker, and
Yes.
Undertaker getting really big, and if you can't answer it, eventually Undertaker gets so big that you can't answer it.
Yes, and then you just win the game. And
Okay.
there's a couple of Digimon decks that are like that. I already mentioned too the first one that we ever had, like true one, was D Reapers, which actually, funny enough, is getting some more support. So cool that they're actually still supporting the original clock deck. But like, if you compare the different speeds at which the different clock decks A were made and B operate, you could really tell how much faster Digimon as a game has gotten. And that's kind of like where this whole thing kind of also started like forming in my brain in terms of like, okay, if they're updating their first clock deck to try to be X fast, what does that say about the game in its current state? Like, is it going to be competitive because they're accelerating it? Is the acceleration fast enough to make it better than the second clock deck, which was Royal Knights, which I think Royal Knights probably still is better. Um, it's really interesting to think about that into perspective. Um, on like what clock deck is faster, when they were made, for where the current state of the game is. And this is where like games kind of to me feel like they want to be Yu-Gi-Oh, but they don't want to be Yu-Gi-Oh at the same time. Like games always tend to break themselves. That's why we have a ban restriction list. And the most common reason for them banning cards is the card performed greater than expected. It created the environment where it was too fast due to this card. That's most of the reasons why most cards get banned. You look at Nadu, and it's just like Nadu from Magic just got banned, thank God, because that card is the epitome of poor pacing in a nutshell. Because not only basically turn 4, the turn after you play Nadu, does the game end because of the combos that Nadu does, but turns take exuberantly long because of how many triggers are firing that you need to manage and maintain and keep track of. And like it just really bogs the game down. And we've had cards get banned for poor pacing outside of an accelerant. We've had the inverse, because the inverse is also true, where there's cards so good that they just functionally slow the game down to not be fun. I'm looking at you, Ice Wall, because Ice Wall states that every attack for any of their Digimon the turn after it's played, you pay 2 memory, and you could create this situation. You pay 2 memory per attack, and you create this situation where it's just like, I'm gonna Ice Wall you. The next turn, I'm gonna Ice Wall you. The next turn, I'm gonna Ice Wall you. So it's just like it created a very unhealthy play pattern where it's just like I'm spending 4 turns basically doing nothing. And that's where Dragon Ball Super is. Yeah, Dragon Ball Super Masters is that way, where they have a ton of like floodgates where it just makes the game very boring and uninteresting on top of the hyper complexity of everything else that's going on. So yeah, having those types of floodgates that slow the game down dramatically are not good for games pacing either.
Well, and it's usually that those type of cards come about because the designers see that the pacing of the game is getting way too fast, because like we talked about earlier, a lot of times the game rules are set up in a way at the base game to kind of help dictate the pace of the game. You can only do, like in Magic, you can only play one land per turn. So that's kind of your restriction on, okay, you can't ramp up because you have four lands in hand. You can't just play all four of them and go absolutely nuts. The rules are there to help kind of dictate what the designers intended to be your normal pacing. I think the problem starts to come about though is later on the designers, they kind of have their design space where they're in, and there's only so much that they can do within the limits of the rules to an extent. And then the designers will start to look at, well, what if I made a card that goes outside of the rules that kind of lets you accelerate things, like in Magic, there's a lot of cards that lets you fetch a land from your deck and you can put it directly onto the battlefield. Normally it's tapped, so you can't benefit off the fact that it's there that turn, but essentially you are accelerating your board state to allow you to do much bigger plays because of it, and therefore you're kind of accelerating the turn pacing that your turns will have going forward.
Yeah, and that's kind of similar to Pokemon, where, like, for whatever reason, they have a ton of abilities that just say, yeah, throw energy onto this thing. And Pokemon's rule is you're only able to play one energy per turn. Well, when you have abilities that just say attach it to this Pokemon, it kind of just bypasses the rules and makes it almost negligible or irrelevant, especially when you also have cards where it's just like, yeah, you could also just play any amount on a Pokemon for free. Like, you could just play as many energies as you want. And, like, that it's always interesting to think about, like, how those types of cards impact the game. Because, like, right now, I know it's not, like, the best tier 1 deck, but Charizard EX right now is, like, doing some pretty good numbers. It's getting a, like, league box or whatever because it did well in a tournament. I have no idea how Pokemon actually works in terms of, like, what product gets made, but basically, like, it's a Pokemon that just throws energy onto itself when you play the card, and that's absolutely crazy because ordinarily you'd need to spend 2 turns putting energy onto that Pokemon, but now here it is just doing it for free, and that's what's making the game go faster, is because now you could attack earlier the second it comes out versus needing to wait. um and yeah, like, Pokemon's just, it's such a interesting case study because of how much it's changed but how little it's actually changed at the same time. But as far as like, other pacing things, like, Digimon tries to basically solution sell. Like, I give the designers lots of props for understanding design shortcomings in their game. And that's why we get these, like, hyper generic staples, which, yes, I kind of think are still on the dangerous side, especially done poorly. And they'll at least, like, look at the game from a bigger picture, look at their base rules and say, okay, what is a card that still kind of plays within the base rules that helps fix an issue with the game? That's why we have memory boosts, that's why we have scrambles, that's why we have training cards. Like, these are all there to try to fix a particular issue with the game, to be able to make the pacing supposedly better. But, what they think and what we think are two completely different things, and we just broke the pacing in half because of the abuse of these cards. Because now in certain playstyles, we just basically do nothing but search for our combo pieces, and then we have a whole back row that's borderline uninteractable, to the point where we just move out and kind of win the game. Like, it it's a very tricky thing to try to tackle when you're trying to introduce cards that are having dramatic influence on the pacing because they're attacking the design of the game as a whole.
Right, like you mentioned, a lot of these cards are usually designed with the intent of helping fix pacing, because I know when I first started playing Digimon way back when, set one was a thing, I can't tell you the number of times that I'm just sitting there not doing anything with my turns, usually just drawing and, maybe put a rookie into raising and that was my turn because I'm sitting here looking for a level 4 or a level 5 Digimon to Digivolve to actually start to keep pushing my opponent because they have a wall that I can't get over. And it's just like, well, I'm not seeing a Digi evolution, and my deck is kind of dependent on, you know, the stack that I'm building. So it doesn't really do me any good to just raw throw out this level 6 because then my turn's over and I just gave my opponent a crap ton of memory to just do whatever they want with. They could easily just play yep, I see you're level 6. I'm just going to kill it. Oh, by the way, I still have a bunch of memory left, so I'm just going to go. So I think a lot of those cards have the good intention of, hey, we see these issues where players don't have enough memory to do a capable turn without putting themselves into the danger zone of passing it over without actually accomplishing much. But those cards were designed for that intent, but does not necessarily mean they have to stick with that intent. There are any number of examples where players are just like, oh, well, this card's just generically good for just abusing, and now I can just accelerate the pacing of my turn tenfold. So what I would expect to be doing on a fourth or a fifth turn, I can now do on turn 2, which
It,
is making the deck hype or making the game so much faster.
yeah, and this is where, like, for Digimon's case more specifically, like, people going back to the recent ban restriction list, like Numemon was very much a clear problem because like if you literally did not have a turn 2 answer, then it is going to start steamrolling, and not a lot of decks did have that turn 2 answer because usually Numemon likes going first because their turn 1 is hatch egg, put Ukomon into raising, pass turn at 1, so that way the opponent, if they don't have a 2 memory play, which sometimes they don't, then they have to pass more memory back over to you, and then you're usually going to be like, okay, cool, I'm going to hard play Numemon. That will usually pass turn again at like 1 or 2 memory, and if they don't have that response answer to that Numemon, they could very easily lose because then the next follow-up turn is just Numemon X into Manzemon X, and to just start going absolutely ballistic on creating a wide field quickly while also killing anything that you would have brought out. And it just became super oppressive. And right now, Imperial is kind of in that same type of a camp where it's one turn slower because usually they're not going off on like their third turn. They're usually going off on their fourth turn because they need to generally set up their tamer, which takes a whole turn in of itself, similarly to Numemon. But they also have so much more pieces that they need to find in order to combo off. Usually they'll be like, play Searcher Rookie, search, let me find the piece, and let me hold the correct Digimon in my raising area, keep that safe for a turn or two. So it's like one turn slower, but still hyper oppressive because when it goes off, it's just so hard to stop. And that's why like ace cards is like kind of the ice wall type of effect where they're trying to make players think twice about attacking. But again, depending on the deck, sometimes that's just a non-issue or a non-factor. It's like, I know against Dexter or Goromon, just as an example, they're not running any aces. So I'm just free to attack. And if they're unable to stop me with any of like their opponent's turn effects, which they have almost none, then I just get free reign to do whatever the heck I want. And while that might not necessarily seem that great, Dexter Regret has its own strengths that could try to play into the offsetting that. But like this is where Imperial just becomes such a problem because it's exemplifying poor pacing issues because of how much advantage the tamer more specifically is getting them, because they could for one memory go from a completely empty board state to a level 5 swinging at your face multiple times, stun locking the field, setting up their level 6 so that way you actually don't, you literally can't respond to that card. And that's like part of the underlying issue is like, oh, they did all of that for one memory. Like, what can I do for one memory? And that's where a lot of like decks kind of are starting to fall short, is because they don't have those crazy one memory plays. And that's what's causing poor pacing issues.
Right, and that goes back to the design of trying to design outside of the standard rule set where, there was kind of an expectation on, hey, this is kind of what we're expecting you to do with X amount of memory, and we're kind of expecting you to be to, this turn generally before this starts to come into play. But to help make cards more powerful and make them more desirable, make them more meta, they tend to do a lot more for a lot less, which will help kind of push this power scaling of the game a little bit further. But obviously, a lot more players will respond more positively to being able to do more for less than they will the reverse, where I am going to play something that makes it harder for you to do more because now you have to pay additional resources that you otherwise would not. Like with your example of Ice Wall. Ice Wall's a really strong slowdown card, which unfortunately, I mean, that's kind of the balance of, hey, we're going to give you these cards that do a lot for little. We're going to balance that out by giving you also cards that make doing a lot really expensive.
Yeah, that's kind of where Digimon Emperor is like playing in right now, and some other floodgates. It's like that's why floodgates are like floodgates are becoming even more important now than they've ever been, because a lot of decks are just fundamentally cheating on the game. There is no sugarcoating it at this point. Like, they are fundamentally just cheating and breaking the game in half, which can be its own level of joy and excitement, but from like a design and balance perspective, that's why I feel like the current ban and restriction list that they just made like 2-3 weeks ago didn't really do enough, because there's still plenty of poor pacing issue decks in the game. Like in Japan, the people call it Galaxy Loop. It's utilizing the Grace Nova cards, and what Japan found out that they could do is just use the low end to basically go into any top ends that they want, and that value package or engine is like absolutely egregiously stupid, and the tamers are broken and highly problematic, as we are learning with spoilers. That even like it doesn't matter what they do; those cards are just dumb. Like, they are just straight up dumb, causing lots of other pacing issues. And going back to kind of what you were saying before, like, Digimon was initially designed around the expected amount of memory to have in a single turn to play with was 3. That's why a lot of evolution cost 3 on the higher stage, is because way back when in the beginning of the game, obviously, you're going to set up your tamer, you're going to evolve in the back, and then move out on your level 5, digivolve into your level 6 to get all of the benefits of it, because it'll usually have a when digivolving effect or when attacking effect, but you need some way to maintain turn while evolving up in there. And that was the crux, like, memory count that the designers intended from the beginning of the game to be able to operate. So now you go from your level 5, level 6, you're at 0 memory, so it still allows you to do something else with your turn to pass the opponent over, and that's kind of where like rookies are super important, or like low cost options, so that way you could pass them at a proper memory count and not give them too much, because if you give them too much now they could do even more. But with the way the pacing of the game has been as of late, that memory shift seems to have literally almost disappeared from them expecting you to have 3 memory to them knowing you're only going to have 1 memory. And now they're basing plays off of having 1 memory, which is becoming highly problematic in terms of everything that you have to do in a single turn.
Right. And then, I mean, that's just going back to, they're going against the fundamental rules that they originally set out for the game, and they're designing cards around the new accelerated turn expectations, which it's just kind of odd in a sense that it's like you have these rules set in place to help kind of dictate the pacing, but you've made so many cards that revolve around outside of the realm of these rule sets that they basically dictate the pacing now. The rules, for the most part, are there just as a formality. They don't actually mean anything.
Yeah, that's so like if anyone's actually interested on why I hate the training cards, that's the big reason why I hate the training cards is because they fundamentally have changed the game in terms of what the game was doing before to what the game was doing after the training cards inclusion because most of the time now we were expected to move out on a level 5 digivolve into a level 6 to make our power turns. That changed from that type of a play to moving out a rookie, evoing for free into a level 5, or for free into a level 4, evo for 1 into a level 5, and then now you could use your level 5, still have memory left over to go into a level 6, and like the dynamic has just changed so much. I'm not saying it's not necessarily a bad thing because you could get some really cool and exciting moments out of it, but at the same time, the problem is now because of this new baseline in terms of what your expected turns are going to be looking like, I don't necessarily think Bandai has the greatest control over that like they did in the past. Like that's why I held BT 13 as like literally the apex of Digimon card design. We had a new clock deck. They had complete and utter mastery on how the game was expected to play at that stage in the game. And I'm not saying we should just, up and abandon, ban a whole bunch of stuff to go back to BT 13. Like, no, but you can still see there's a lot of decks that are operating on like less than BT 13 level. And these are new decks. And this is why, like, you get a set like EX7 where it's basically dead on arrival because nothing is able to compete because nothing is operating at that new speed threshold. I mean, granted,
Right.
they tried to put in a couple of mechanics for at least the Liberator decks to fix that with Overclock and Vortex, where it's like, oh, I passed memory, I could still kind of do something. So they're experimenting with it, but most of those decks just aren't doing anything, and it's unfortunate that they're just unable to compete because they can't meet the new standards.
Right. They made new standards and they're outside the rule set, so now they have to do a completely different new design base to try and balance around it. Unfortunately, they don't have the rules anymore. It's just kind of this it's not a solid line on the ground anymore. It's just kind of this wavy, kind of like a wave where it ebbs and flows. Like, sometimes you're, you don't have to do all that much to kind of get ground back, but other times it's like, God, there's literally no way.
Yeah, and then because of all of the added complexity, turns are now taking way longer because like they just going back to Galaxy Loop, I think that deck in a similar vein, Pulsemon is just really convolutedly stupid because of just all of the unnecessary extra actions that those decks are doing to be able to achieve basically the same output as some of, you know, the other normal decks because they're operating at a completely different pacing level. Because it's just like, oh, with Galaxy Loop, just as an example, I'm going to raise out my level 3, use the effect to put the level 3 under the level 2, Digivolve into the level 3, gain 2 memory. So now I started off doing like 2 separate actions just to gain 2 memory, and then Digivolve for free, and then loop again, just to gain 1 memory this time. And like it feels like just so much added unnecessary extra steps that it just bogs the game like down, making it overall less enjoyable.
Well, you're you're just getting into that more combo heaviness area where the games themselves, when you're doing a turn count, they are getting faster, but at the same time, the games are taking just as much time, if in some cases not more, because each turn now is an increase in time. So whereas you know at the start you may have been expecting a game to take 7 to 9 turns, and it's going to take you 15 to 20 minutes to play a game. Well, probably not that long, but we'll just say 15 to 20 minutes to play a game. Now, the games are over in 3 to maybe 5 turns for a lot, they're going a lot faster turn wise, but they're still taking that 15 to 20 minutes because there's so many actions now that you're taking in those turns. You're basically saying, hey, where before I would be doing this in turns 1, 2, and 3, now I can reasonably do all the way up to my turn 3 on turn 1. My turn 2 is basically going to be a turn 5. You're basically compressing your turn counters, increasing the amount of actions that need to be taken, ineffectively shortening the game, but the time spent playing the game has not changed.
Yeah, this is why some people want cards to like come off the ban and restriction list, is because those cards that were previously banned under that speed limit, or like speed limiter, I guess, those ones that broke the speed limiter, they should come off because that speed limiter right now for the current state of the game is no longer broken. Like back in like BT 10, 11, 12, and 13, evoing for 1 into a level 5 was a very rare occurrence, and it was very good. The fact that like Greymon X Antibody enabled that obviously made Greymon one of the better decks because it just made Greymon move faster, and that was the contributing factor. But now, because I could just do an Imperial off of an empty board state for 1 memory, go from nothing to a level 5 Digimon. Is that Geo, or not Geo, is that Greymon X Antibody really that egregious at this point? I still think the answer is yes, because that's like a testament to where bad game design is. And like, even though, yes, technically right now, according to today's standards, that card actually isn't an issue, like that should be the issue in of itself, is the fact that that is not technically seen as an issue. And like that's my personal gripe with the game, and how they completely just and utterly destroyed the good pacing that they once had. And I think, like, honestly, the designers, like the old designer, when they designed, what are we on, Block 3? I think I could just look in front of me because I have my Leomon deck sitting in front of me. Yes, Block 3. Block 3 was a complete and utter mistake from the ground up inception level, because it just took every good piece of pacing that Block 2 had after a couple of bans and restrictions and absolutely destroyed it. The introduction to memory boost, or not memories, trainings, was at the start of Block 3. We have so much more free evolutions, or like the ability to gain memory back to basically just do more things with our turns. Like, it, there was a huge shift in Block 3 compared to anything else that we've seen. And that's kind of like what I wanted to try to highlight here, is like, hey, I know other games have their pacing issues. Like Yu-Gi-Oh's is just basically built into the game at this point because they didn't have a resource system, and that game's just Combo City the game. But that's not exactly what Digimon is. And if they are continuing with that Block 3 pacing in terms of how they're treating the game, if they were trying to one-up it, I honestly think Digimon could end up getting into like dumb Yu-Gi-Oh levels of stupid, which is something every game should actively try to avoid. But it's always funny to see and think that every game is actively trying to get there at the same time, while not trying to get there, because obviously they know that's a problem, but Yu-Gi-Oh is the problem in of itself. Not saying that it's affecting other card games. It's just everything just wants to be faster, stronger, operate on less, and that's why like you see some of the best cards costing so little.
Well, it almost sounds like from your previous statement, you're inferring that the designers looked at the Greymon they banned and they said, yes, yes, this was an absolute great idea. How can we get here, but not quite this far? And I mean, it's the same with your analogy of a lot of games know that they don't want to be Yu-Gi-Oh, where it's just this massive combo fest, but a lot of them try to get to that level. It's like the story. It's like all the games are trying to play the story of Icarus. They're trying to see how close to the sun that they can get because the sun is the great glorious thing in the sky, and they want to be as close to it as possible. But they also know that they need to be just far enough away that the wax on the wings don't melt and they go tumbling straight down and plummeting to the earth.
Yeah, and like Buddy Fight was the game that I was playing competitively before I hopped over to Digimon, and that basically was the epitome of the Yu-Gi-Oh effect, where that game had so much power creep that literally the game devolved into OTKs, the game. Like if you do not kill the opponent on your turn one because of everything that you're doing, you're barely even playing the game at that point. And it's up to, and again, similar to the Yu-Gi-Oh effect, it's up to the like opponent to have the proper responses to not get OTK'd the best that they possibly can. And funny enough, Buddy Fight actually has a anniversary set that's coming out with a whole bunch of new cards that were eventually supposed to make it into the game, and almost all of those cards introduce anti-OTK tactics. So like like even in post, they understood what they did was wrong, and they're trying to not, oh, I guess not really retroactively. They're trying to just react to where the game ended up and try to fix it in post, which I think is like a fantastic thing. It's just unfortunately where the game left off and where the game it currently is. It's like, why bother? But I appreciate the hustle when it comes to at least acknowledging that they made those mistakes and made cards to try to fix them. And with Digimon, with the Greymon example, they design certain cards almost in a bubble. Like they design, I'm always having a hard time understanding how they designed their cards, because it's like Geo Greymon was made in, or not Geo. I keep saying Geo. I have too much Marcus and Shine Greymon on my brain. But Greymon X Antibody was supposed to be designed with BT8 Metal Greymon in mind. That card had an Evo cost of 4. So utilizing Greymon X Antibody's cost reduction ability, it made it 2 to Evo into. But then, literally the following set, they printed a Metal Greymon that was 3 costs to Evo into, which now means that Greymon X Evos for 1 into it, and that was therefore a problem. Uh, like, it's so weird. Like, I get where they're coming from, but I also don't understand either at the same time. It's so hilarious how disconnected things can feel.
Well, and I mean, there's always a disconnect. The designers will have something in mind when they're designing sets, they're designing cards, they have these are the things that they're looking at when they're designing the cards. And then when they hand those exact same cards over to the players, it's very, very often that they will notice, oh, we didn't think about that. Oh, we didn't consider that. Oh, yeah, that's a thing that we've kind of forgot about. And I mean, it's not a knock on the designers, because as somebody who's done some card game design, it's like you kind of get stuck looking at the narrow scope, and it's just like, oh yeah, yeah, this card's going to do these kind of interactions, and it'll be wonderful. And it's very easy to lose sight of the whole picture, and everything that you have to kind of take into consideration when you're designing a card, because it's like, oh well, this card has these attributes, so it can interact with these. I haven't even considered, if it interacts with this card with this ability, oh god, that's going to be terrible. It's absolutely busted. And I mean, I'm certain that's how you can get certain things like in Magic where they'll print infinite combos in the standard format. And it's like, yeah, that's not good, guys. You don't want that.
Yeah, I mean, I like working in the industry myself. If anyone's actually curious on some of my actual like history with card design, I worked on a little dead TCG called Argent Saga, and believe me, I walked into an infinite combo in the game that I pretty much couldn't do anything about by set two. And that was very damaging to the game. So, if anyone's curious, the combo is Mutant 002 Reprobloom. So, Reprobloom has the ability when it's targeted by an effect, it creates two basically token copies of itself. But we had in set one, I think it's like called Gloomstalker. I'm just looking it up right now. Gloomstalk. God. I think it's called Gloomstalker. But basically, Gloomstalker is a free sack outlet where the way the game works, sacking a card is a target. Like it's a targeted ability. So it's like I'm targeting the card to be sacrificed. Therefore, that triggers Reprobloom's ability to then create two more tokens, and then you could use that to basically go infinite. So it was just kill. It was a kill the field infinite, not like win the game infinite. But the fact that you could still do that made it so that the opponent couldn't actually play the game, which was dumb in of itself. But that was like a huge design oversight that we had just because of all of the different pressures we had. So like any game that can hold off on making infinite combos is like very commendable, which is something Bandai generally doesn't do a whole lot, is just have infinite combos. Digimon has them. Don't get me wrong. It's just sometimes they're not always the most feasible, or they are just kind of hard to pull off, making it so they're not actually worth it.
Well, and then a lot of times that's why you're relying on the base rules too, because a lot of times the base rules should be designed in a way to help prevent it. It's once you start venturing, cards start venturing outside of being limited by the rules, that's when you start running into it. But, you can also do a lot of things in the rule set that can help limit it because, like Magic doesn't have a field size. Yu-Gi-Oh has a tentative, field size of 5 monsters and then 5 spell and trap zones.
Yeah, I
If you
mean, rules and limits definitely can help manage and mitigate that type of stuff as well. I will say that. And it is just how the designers are interpreting what the card wants to do. And sometimes it is just a poorly designed card, like going back to Nadu. The designer openly admitted, like, hey, we actually didn't test Nadu, so we had no idea how this card was going to perform. We just thought it was going to be like a for fun card. And I mean, they've said that a lot for a lot of casual cards that are highly competitive, like Collective Company. I watch way too much Desolator Magic when it comes to like his analysis of cards. I know he's not the greatest barometer of like YouTuber to watch, but man, is he entertaining at like just sometimes having some really funny hot takes. But sometimes he's like not that far off to like his, feelings being somewhat justified, because he kind of had a rule that I like as a designer I kind of respect, where it's just like free shouldn't actually be free. Like Bandai loves hiding their free by not free actions, where it's just like, oh no, this isn't actually free. You have to do something else beforehand, then it becomes free. And like Bandai's really bad and notorious at that. Like, look at Gecko Moria from One Piece. Like, he's an 8 cost card that plays a 4 cost that generally cascades into another card. Like, he's giving you at least like 12 to 16 um, Dawn worth of value for 8, and just because of how much he's like cheesing on the entire game. And I think like that type of design is like really bad and unhealthy overall, just because that does increase the tempo in terms of accelerating the game state to come to a conclusion. And I think, and I get that that's probably what a cost card in that game should do, but not at the cost of the fact that now, because it's spawning 2 to 3 extra bodies, it's making it that much harder to be able to respond to.
Well, it's very possible that a card was originally designed as a, oh hey, I'm behind my opponent. I need to build board fast and build it for cheap.
Yeah, it could have been. I haven't delved too deep into One Piece card design, but it kind of feels similar to Digimon, where it's just like cards are designed in their little pockets or bubbles, where it's just like, okay, all of the any slobby cards are supposed to be playing with any slobby cards. But because like One Piece breaks the mold so often on like, oh, we just made these also generically good. Like, you're just playing generically good stuff dot deck with your little like built-in package or engine based on the leader or faction or tribe or whatever you're actually playing with. Digimon kind of does this, where it's just like, okay, you're playing Pulsemon, play all the Pulsemon based cards. That's a good way to start building your deck. And on that end, it makes deck building easier, but at the other end, like it makes it oddly enough more balanced, because there's less interactions with outside cards that they then have to think about. And I think like that's usually the big problem on when uh I guess more Bandai specific games, because this does seem like a Bandai issue more than any other issue, is when they make cards too general or generic, which we've already kind of covered before in a different episode. That's when problems start emerging, especially when they're using those types of cards to try to increase the tempo or pacing of the game.
So what I'm hearing is the simple solution is we just make every single deck almost entirely out of generics, and then you just have like 4 or 5 cards of the flavor that you want to be the basically the coup de grace of your deck. Everybody will play the same deck. Everyone will have the same tempo.
I mean, One Piece isn't too far from that with Black, because like, so Bandai usually does engines. So similar to Yu-Gi-Oh, Bandai loves their engines. They're just like, okay, going back to a Digimon example, Galaxy Loop. It's just like, okay, you have the Light Fang and Nightclaw engine. So you're running that little package, and then you're just running whatever top ends that you want, because it just works. Like, it literally just works. And it's annoying that way, and that's how a card like Apocalypse came to be, is because like, oh, we totally forgot to actually add restrictions and limitations to the card, which is why the card was broken, and so broken to the point where it nearly destroyed a lot of the game and caused a lot of people to hate it as a result. And Shoto is in that same type of category, where it's just another dumb generic card that goes into everything. But this is like the big fear that they had initially with hybrids, in yellow hybrids, and why Jet Selfie got banned, is because or not, I'm saying banned, limited. They don't really ban anything, which I think they honestly should start banning more, but that's a topic in of itself. But that's one of the big reasons why Jet Selfie got limited, is because, one, the card for the time in that game's history, evoing for 1 into a level 5 was functionally too fast. It was too fast even in BT12. So Jet Selfie doing that while being able to have the flexibility to use any yellow level 6 Digimon in the game means that they're basically not changing their deck. They're just playing yellow hybrids plus whatever good level 6 that they are going to run. And Galaxy Loop is in that same type of category. They're not changing their deck, they're just changing the few top end cards. And I think like those little engines, while they're cute, they're highly problematic for that factor.
Right, because they're they're basically dictating at a completely outside the realm pace that a lot of the other decks aren't going to be able to match.
Right, and that's why we have to therefore then run counterattack and floodgates just to be able to match it, which was again going back to like BT10 as an example with Shoutmon Cross 4, a, a rush body swinging at 1 for 0 that could then loop itself if you have the right cards to then play itself again for basically a net 0. If you do all of the cross stuff, it's actually 1 memory, but the deck has ways to gain it back so it actually makes it nothing. Or no, I think that card was actually a net 0 and then looped itself. So something along those lines. And that's why that was highly problematic, is because, having a pretend cost is and not actually paying the cost, like that's where balance breaks, because you put the cost on the card for a reason. Like that's what the card of the cost on the card, God, I can't speak. But that's what the cost on the card was meant there for. That's the balancing act. So now going from a point where it's just like, yeah, we could just ignore that now, like that's how things end up breaking. And like right now with the speed of evolution and the speed of playing things for free and then evolving and gaining memory, which basically makes it free actions, like it's all going to be compounding on itself. And if Bandai literally doesn't like course correct and start fixing those more specific issues with their design going forward, I honestly think Digimon is only going to get worse than what we've already had in the past. And that's really sad to say because I love this game a lot and I don't want it to become Yu-Gi-Oh, to put it plain and simple. Like if I wanted to play Yu-Gi-Oh, there's Yu-Gi-Oh for that. I'm playing Digimon for Digimon.
You don't want to play Yu-Gi-Oh with a Digimon skin?
No. Zero interest, because that was Buddy Fight to me. And like as much fun as Buddy Fight was, because I loved the aesthetics of Buddy Fight, they had some of the best monster and creature designs out there. But Bushiroad generally does a good job on that anyway. Um, like it wasn't fun. Like Yu-Gi-Oh is not fun. There's a reason why Lorcana in the state, like in North America, is beating out Yu-Gi-Oh, is because nobody wants to play that type of a game, and the people who do are masochists. Sorry, Yu-Gi-Oh fans. Like, sorry, not sorry. I tried to play your game. It's just not fun.
Well, and I think that's a big turnoff because a buddy of mine who's a was a Yu-Gi-Oh player, that was the big reason why he stopped playing. He's just like, yeah, it's not very engaging when I sit here for 15 minutes and my opponent looks up and says, "Hey, I'm going to do this. Can you stop me?" No? Okay. Game 2?
Yeah, and I think that's why a lot of people are gravitating towards One Piece, because compared to all of Bandai's card games right now, honestly, I think like outside of some like egregiously dumb metas and really bad decisions, like from again, from a base game standpoint, rules, like not looking at individual cards, just looking at the rules of the game as is, One Piece probably has some of the best pacing I have ever seen. And then again, Bandai does the Bandai thing and just finds ways to absolutely destroy that. But like on base, that's what a lot of people were drawn into about One Piece outside of the IP, of course, because, having one of the biggest IPs in the world is definitely a huge appeal. Just look at Pokemon for that, too.
Well, and One Piece also has the benefit of being a younger game than Digimon. Obviously, the longer a game it has existed, it's going to have a lot more design that it's already run through. It's going to have a lot more cards. It's going to have a lot more sets, which means it has a greater potential to have disruptions to the pacing and all of that all of that nonsense. Whereas One Piece is relatively young, they still probably have a lot of design that they can do within the already like centrally established rule set to help guide the pacing. Yeah, you can obviously venture out of it a little bit, and a good solution, as you said, for making things cheaper or making them quote unquote free is not actually making them free by giving them some sort of cost that you have to do beforehand or some kind of detriment cost that is supposed to kind of set you back. So that's an approach that I tend to like to see is, hey, we made this card cheaper on this front, but you're making up for it somewhere else. That's a pretty common thing in Black for Magic is, oh, hey, I want to draw 2 cards. Normally if this card was in blue, it would just kind of be a generic pay 3, draw 2. But in Black, we can kind of shave on that mana cost a little bit because there is a fair number of them that are pay 2 mana, draw 2. The additional cost, however, comes in, and I guess you could essentially think of it now as paying a Phyrexian mana, where you're paying 2 life instead of that extra mana, but you're still essentially, conceptually, paying the same amount. You're just divvying up where you're paying the costs from.
Yeah, I think it's like divination versus like read the bones type of a thing. It's like divination costs 4 to draw 2 or 3, and read the bones is like pay 3 to draw 2 and scry 2 but lose 2 life. So
Mm-hmm.
like it's a little bit cheaper, has some slightly better benefits to it because it's also cheaper at some sort of downside. And I think like that goes to how to design good cards is there should, for every type of positive there needs to be a negative. Like there has to be. Like that's why I initially really liked Ace Digimon, is because sure, hand counter blast digivolution, evo for 0 into this card on the opponent's turn after all of their when attacking effects are done and every other effect that's triggering as a result of that. Um, like free evolution on the opponent's turn, that's really good. But if it was just that, there would be the card would absolutely be broken. So what they did to counter that was they always pair up ace cards with overflow costs, where it's just like, okay, when the card dies or leaves the field, gets bounced to hand, whatever, when it leaves, you lose that memory. So that's the cost is put on the back end. And I think like that's fine as long as there actually is some sort of downside. Obviously, because there's no initial frontward cost to the card, it makes it extremely powerful because there is no frontward cost. And if they can't get to the downside, then the downside doesn't exist. That's why Gravity Crush is still an insanely good card. Gain 2, but at the beginning of the opponent's turn, they gain 2. There's no way to stop that. So they just always do it. But if you kill them with the 2 that you got before their turn even comes, doesn't matter. There is no downside. And I think those are a little bit more fine, even though those do have profound impact on how the overall pacing of the game goes. But that's why I liked what the initial ace cards were doing, is because similar to Icewall, they were making the opponent think about their attacks. Certain decks like Mirage Gaugamon now became slightly worse just because of Ace's existence. Because if the Ace is good enough to out the level 5 or the 6 on the attack that they need to make, cool. That's just the dynamic of the game, and that's more of a matchup thing. And that's what made BT15 so interesting of a format after the bans and restrictions, is just it was the most open format we've ever had in Digimon history. Like point blank, simple, period, whatever. I think like the pacing started to have some issues because we had Ukamons and whatnot, especially the broken one. But I felt like the game was in a better state in that type of environment than what we're currently experiencing. Because there's a reason why blue decks always tend to do well in Digimon, and that's because they, by default, have better pacing than the majority of the other decks in the entire game. That's why they limited Hammer Spark, is because, oh, every blue deck has access to Hammer Spark. Cool. We can't have that because every blue deck is already that much more efficient than some other decks. I'm obviously exaggerating here. It's not every blue deck, but a good portion of blue decks just operate faster and are more consistent than the average deck.
Well, and if a game's pacing changes over the course of its lifetime, it's not necessarily a bad thing if the change is received well. But if you have players that are used to a certain level of pacing, generally they are going to like to stick to that level of pacing. And, as we've mentioned, when you take a game that generally is supposed to be 7 to 9 turns and you compress it down into 3 to 5, I mean, is that a positive change in pacing? Is this what a lot of players, do they enjoy the much faster paced game? I mean, obviously the designers had something in mind when they originally designed it to be a 7 to 9 turn game. What over the course of the years has caused them to change that to be a much faster paced game? Or in the reverse, what would make them change it and make the game slower? Make the pacing have a longer total turn count.
Yeah, I mean, that's all very fair. And, like, all of this, for the most part, is, like, kind of just subjective because, like, obviously, we're just participants in TCGs and just things that we notice between the games. And obviously, this is where some people gravitate toward other games than that extend past just the IP and general interest, is like overall game pacing. Like, I know a lot of like shills usually will hop game to game because, that's what gets them the most clicks the fastest, or they just want to try to be competitive while the environment is fresh, so that way they could try to, prove themselves. But what really keeps people in the game for the long term, again, outside of IP, is, the actual gameplay and the pacing of the game, because it's just like, okay, I know I reasonably could finish a best 2 of 3 in 30 minutes. Like, that's a time frame that I know I have to be able to commit to this type of game. And if everyone else kind of follows in that same vein, then that's where event math comes in. And it's just like, okay, then we reasonably could finish like a nice 16-man event in less than 4 hours. Like, that's something that you could commit to because of how the game is paced. So there's obviously more factors that go into it, and like, we're only just reaching the surface of like how game pacing kind of just works in general. But it is very interesting because usually, at least like from mine and Mark's experience going through design school together, we usually wanted to have a target time that the games that we're making is supposed to take to play and or complete, especially when it comes to more of the tabletop centric side of things, because we don't want to be stuck in the Warhammer situation where games will last 7 hours for a single match. That sometimes is a huge turnoff and a bigger commitment than what people want, especially when it comes to like the Japanese side of things. Things are a little bit more culturally fast, so it is natural for them to want to kind of shift the gears to have faster paced games in general.
Right. I mean, that also makes a big difference once you start talking about cultural differences between, Japan, the US, Europe, Australia, anybody that, plays the game. They're going to have completely different opinions on how they prefer to play the game over the others. I mean, one region might be very favorable to the control decks, the long play decks. They like that slower pace, the more methodical, a nice cadence to it. Whereas a different region might be a complete opposite. They want to get in, they want to literally do as few turns as humanly possible, and they just want the game to be over with in as few minutes as humanly possible. And you might have the middle ground where you got people that want to do those mid-range decks where they might pop off in the early game and just steamroll, or It might take a little bit more setup, but it has that consistency of, hey, I'm not really ever falling behind because the deck is designed in a way to always have a good pace. Even, doesn't matter if it's early game, it doesn't matter if it's late game, but I mean, if we're talking mid-range decks, they're not going to have the super aggressive early game that aggro does, and they won't have the same lasting power as control decks when it comes to that late long game.
Yeah, and that's why the different deck types kind of like help influence the overall pacing of the game. And like, it's not always a written in stone type thing. Unlike with TCGs, more specifically, unlike actual board games, where they're just like, yeah, here's the actual recommended time frame that this should reasonably take you with base level understanding of the rules. That's why they have those little timer things where it's just like this game takes half hour to complete, which I appreciate, but depending on with TCGs how players and play styles, decks and game design, like there's a lot that influence how a game is overall paced. And right now, I am personally having some issues with the current state of the game. I'm not quitting the game by any stretch of the word. It's just I'm trying to come to terms and understand my issues with the game and where my shortcomings are. And honestly, I think like this is kind of where a lot of this just stemmed, was pacing issues, because I was having long discussions with some of my guys at locals, and literally it was just like, oh, on Imperial, you just do so much for basically nothing. And if you get two tamers out, then you actually do everything for nothing. Which is like mind-bogglingly crazy that it just off of an empty field can just do everything and potentially kill the opponent. And same thing with like Mirage. If it has an inch, it will take the mile if it's unchecked and unstopped. And like same thing with Galaxy Loop and all of these other decks. Like it just feels like there's just these moments where I'm just sitting here doing nothing, watching as my opponent basically gets to play things for net zero, if not actually gaining memory to make even more powerful plays possible. And then that's what's making turn length just take longer and turn counts take shorter. And it's I don't know. I hope Bandai really starts to understand some of these issues and stop printing specific types of cards to stop enabling this type of play style. But I know some people really do enjoy that type of play style, and I also don't want to rob them of that. But my underlying issue does come down to, I think that the game's overall pacing is off, and it's not exactly where it used to be after a seasoned veteran playing the game for 17 sets since its inception, being a nationals player, like nationals level player multiple times. Like it just to me feels like something is off, and I'm trying to put my finger on where it is. And pacing definitely feels like it might be a big underlying issue, but that's just a me. It could just be a me thing. It honestly could, because again, this is all just subjective. So
Right, you have the expectation of the game pacing to be X, but with the newer sets, the game pacing, the designers have definitely shifted it more towards a Y level of pacing. And as
yeah,
somebody who's played the games for so long and is expecting that X level pacing, the new Y level pacing to you is just like, well, no, this isn't right. And like you said, and like I was trying to make a little bit of a counter argument, game pacing to everybody is going to be a little bit different. What one person likes is a certain pace to the game. Somebody else is absolutely going to abhor and hate everything about it.
yeah, and that's why we generally play the decks that we play or gravitate towards the play styles, is so that way we could try to get more comfortable with the pacing. And again, this is why it might be a me issue, is I can't find the deck that I want that has the pacing that I want while still being meta competitive and relevant, obviously, of course.
I was going to say, and that'll be the big thing. It's just like, a certain game, theoretically speaking, all games should have what I call the three basic archetypes: your aggro deck, your mid-range deck, your control deck. But it's very, very possible that the meta just simply does not support control decks being viable. They're just not, they just don't have enough resources to stop that aggressive aggro early play to get into their late game where they shine, where they're, whether it's a control deck that's going on attrition or it's a control deck on, hey, I just need to hold you off long enough. Not necessarily an attrition deck in that sense, but just kind of a stall deck till I get to my big thing that you won't be able to answer.
Yeah, and like I was talking with East in a couple of episodes ago, like the rules of Digimon definitely support more mid-range to aggressive style of gameplay. Like that is just point blank the simplest factor to just where a lot of people tend to gravitate is because of how the rules are laid out, favors those types over more control style decks, which I think is fine. Not everything needs to like support all of the archetypes as long as they can be represented in some form. That's why I find like for Digimon, clock decks are probably the form of control that control players are looking for, and I think the way clock decks are designed for how the game's rule set is, that is the healthiest thing that they can kind of make that caters towards those types of players. Um, but yeah, this is all like just really. We could go on forever about just all of the minutiae of game pacing, but this is just a good base level of understanding that two designers have with game design with lots of TCG experience to try to wrap our brains around not only just Digimon, but the TCG industry as a large and just TCGs in general. And I just find it always to be fascinating because each game is different, but they all want a similar outcome. And it's just the roads and steps that they take to get to that similar outcome. Some get there faster than others, Yu-Gi-Oh! But not everyone wants that level from both a player and a designer perspective, and a company perspective too. So I know based on some of the future sets, Block 4 is definitely looking a lot healthier of a block compared to Block 3. So hopefully there's something, whether it's more bans and restrictions or just cards that are going to be more proactively better at trying to slow down the game. I think though that's going to be the big telltale sign on how healthy the game can be. I think like the game as a whole is still like one of the healthiest games on the TCG market. Again, personal opinion. But in terms of pacing and trying to fix the damage that Block 3 had, I think that they can manage to get out of this lull or woe that was Block 3 as a whole. So, any closing thoughts, Mark, on game pacing?
No, I think in general it's a subjective matter, but definitely when the game is originally designed, you look at those first sets, you you'll get a good sense of where the designer's headspace was, where they intended the game pacing to be. And then you can kind of look as the sets have progressed if the designers have stayed true to that original design where they wanted the pacing to be, or how have they changed it? Have they tried to accelerate that pacing? Have they tried to slow that pacing down? Or, kind of like the matter of power creep. Like, if they power creep too much this way, or in this case, if they speed the game pacing up, you know, can you find instances where they try to interject and try to slow that pacing down, try to find that nice balance and keep it where they originally designed? I mean, that's always a very interesting thing that I like to look at, see where they wanted it to be, and see if they tried to keep it there or if they ultimately changed directions at some point down the road.
Yeah, and I think like as new designers as designers come and go working on a game, you definitely can see like a little bit of them in those initial designs on how they are tackling some of the issues that they're facing as designers. Not only just making new cards, but trying to control and maintain a game's overall pacing. And like that's at the end of the day kind of just what I'm kind of like trying to get at, is trying to put myself into their headspace to try to figure out what was their intention out of the game, and like what as a player I can do to find what I enjoy out of the proper pacing that I like at a high competitive level. It's a lot more to ask for the more competitive I go, because on a competitive side, everything needs to be hyper fast for the most part. A lot of even the control decks still need to operate on as little as possible to keep up with everything else that's operating in as little as possible. And I think like that's the big disparity, is because Digimon has this like imbalance where not all decks and not all archetypes are created equally, and some decks can use engines and others can't, to facilitate really dumb stuff. Like it's just figuring out that balance that is the hard part on what pacing you're comfortable with. Because right now, I'm not comfortable with it, and it's getting me agitated and frustrated, and maybe I just need to wait a set or two in order for something to come out that changes the game's pacing. I don't know. That's a journey I have to take, and hopefully this was insightful for you to find what kind of like objectively speaking pacing you as a player enjoy in the game, and kind of figure out what you like, and maybe this will help you understand and come to terms with some of that a little bit better on a deeper level. So if that's everything, then I think we are good to kind of just close things out. So thank you, Mark, for once again joining me on this design and philosophical TCG endeavor.
Anytime.
And at this point, I also want to thank all of you, the audience, the viewers, for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode and want to help support the podcast, you already know what to do. Please make sure to share it with everyone on social media so we can get it to spread, and to do all those social media doobly-doos. And with that, thank you again for listening, and we will see you in the next episode.